March 14th, 2018. The Vienna State Opera. Ozzy Osbourne had never watched an opera in his life. He was 69 years old, his left hand trembled more with each passing day, and as he climbed the marble staircase holding onto his wife's arm, the only thought in his mind was not to fall asleep during the first act. That night, there were 2,200 people in the hall. Professors, diplomats, Austrian aristocracy. None of them recognized Ozzy. The musicology professor sitting in the box next to his took him for a strange English tourist. The attendant at the door didn't even glance at his face while checking his ticket. But 1 hour and 43 minutes later, the conductor leading that evening's Tosca would abandon diplomats mid-conversation and rush toward Ozzy to tell him about the night that changed his life 13 years ago. Vienna thought it was going to teach Ozzy Osbourne a lesson that evening. What happened was the exact opposite. Ozzy hadn't come to Vienna by choice. When Sharon had revealed the plan a week earlier, his reaction had been clear. "Opera? Sharon, I've never been to an opera in my life. I caught one on the telly once, fell asleep in 5 minutes. Don't really think it's my thing." Sharon hadn't laughed. "Ozzy, Dr. Feldman has a meeting in Vienna, and you're coming. Then we're going to the opera. They're playing Tosca. It'll be good for you." Dr. Feldman was the Austrian neurologist who had been monitoring Ozzy for the past 2 years. The tremor in Ozzy's left hand, the unsteadiness in his walk, the way words occasionally got stuck on the tip of his tongue. There was no official diagnosis yet, but Sharon knew. The appointment with Dr. Feldman was an excuse. The opera was part of Sharon's strategy to keep Ozzy connected to life. "I'm not going to sit and watch you waste away in front of the television every day," Sharon had said one evening, her voice both sharp and fragile. Ozzy hadn't argued. If there was one thing he'd learned in 40 years, it was the pointlessness of arguing with Sharon Osbourne. Box 11 was on the second tier, one of the finest boxes in the Vienna State Opera, a space that preserved the grandeur of the era with its 6 velvet-upholstered red seats and a direct view of the stage. Sharon had arranged everything in advance. She'd had Ozzy's tuxedo brought over from London, had even chosen the cufflinks herself. But Ozzy was still Ozzy. He'd managed to wear a black band t-shirt under his tuxedo. When his collar fell slightly open, the torn lettering of the Black Sabbath logo peeked through. When Sharon noticed, she'd simply rolled her eyes. "At least he's wearing trousers," she'd muttered. The other 4 seats in box 11 were occupied by 2 couples. The first couple were an Austrian diplomat and his wife, both in their 70s. Quiet, polite, in their own world. But the second couple were different. Professor Dr. Heinrich Weber was 63 years old and head of the musicology department at the University of Vienna. Over a 40-year academic career, he had written 4 books on Wagner, served on the advisory board of the Salzburg Festival, and held the Austrian Republic's Medal of Honor for Science and Art. His wife Margaret was a former soprano, now retired, but still the kind of woman who prepared for every opera as though she were about to take the stage herself. Her pearls were real, her gaze was sharp, and she assessed every person entering the box with the precision of a concert critic. When Ozzy and Sharon entered the box, Margaret's eyes first caught the rings on Ozzy's fingers, then the silver cross around his neck, then the torn lettering of the t-shirt peeking out from under his tuxedo. She pursed her lips and whispered to her husband in German. "Heinrich, what is this man doing here? Do you think he's confused it with a rock concert?" Heinrich looked at Ozzy over the top of his glasses, assessed him. A faint trace of contempt formed at the corner of his lips. "Probably an Englishman dragged here by his wife," he said quietly. "Don't worry, he'll be asleep once Tosca starts." Margaret let out a hushed laugh. Sharon heard it. She didn't speak German, but you don't need a dictionary to recognize the tone of one woman looking down on another. Ozzy didn't hear. He was busy fiddling with the buttons on the small subtitle tablet in the box, trying to switch the screen to English. At 7:30, the lights went dark. The 3,000-kilogram crystal chandelier dimmed slowly, and the first note rose from the orchestra pit. Tosca's opening chords, Scarpia's theme, harsh, menacing, dark. Ozzy's body tensed slightly. Sharon looked at her husband and saw something familiar. She knew that look. Ozzy was listening to the music, really listening. Eyes fixed on the stage, breath held, the outside world completely forgotten. When was the last time she'd seen that look? Maybe during the studio sessions in 2010, maybe even before that. Throughout the first act, Ozzy didn't move. The scene where Scarpia corners Tosca, the magnificent finale of the Te Deum, the orchestra's crescendo. Ozzy's fingers gripped the velvet armrest of his seat. His eyes were narrowed. The music was passing through him. Bass notes that seeped into the bones, a baritone that echoed in the chest. This wasn't like a rock concert. It was a slower, more calculated, more merciless kind of beauty. Puccini didn't hit you the way Ozzy was used to. It seeped into you slowly. Halfway through the first act, Heinrich glanced over at Ozzy. He hadn't fallen asleep as expected, but Heinrich misread the expression on the man's face. Probably doesn't understand a thing, but he's trying to stay awake, he thought. He smiled faintly at his wife. Margaret returned it with that familiar look that said, "I told you these people don't understand music." When the first act ended, the hall filled with applause. Ozzy didn't clap. He kept his hands on his knees, his eyes still on the stage, even though it had already gone dark. Sharon leaned in and whispered, "What did you think?" Ozzy didn't answer for a few seconds. Then he turned and said something Sharon hadn't expected. "Scarpia's a right evil git, but I liked his voice." Sharon laughed. She knew her husband of 40 years. This was the highest compliment in Ozzy's language of, "I'm impressed, but I'm not going to say it outright." Intermission, 20 minutes. At the Vienna State Opera, the intermission was a ritual. People would leave their boxes, make their way to the Gustav Mahler Hall or the Marble Hall, collect the champagne they'd ordered in advance, size each other up, and show off to one another. Sharon ordered 2 glasses of champagne. Ozzy was looking at the tapestries on the wall, hands shoved in his tuxedo pockets, rocking gently back and forth. It was at that moment that Heinrich and Margareta Weber entered the hall. Margareta spotted Ozzy immediately. She gave her husband's arm a light squeeze and gestured with her head. Heinrich took a sip from his glass and walked toward Ozzy. His intention was simple: to find out who this man was, to understand why he had such good seats in the box, and perhaps to break the monotony of the evening with a bit of conversation. Sharon saw the couple approaching and put on her diplomatic smile. Heinrich bowed his head politely. "Good evening. We're box neighbors but haven't been introduced. Professor Heinrich Weber, University of Vienna." Sharon extended her hand. "Sharon Osbourne, and my husband, John." Ozzy turned. "Ozzy," he said briefly, without extending his hand. Just a nod. Heinrich's eyes narrowed. The surname Osbourne and the name Ozzy triggered something somewhere, but he couldn't make the connection. Margaret didn't recognize him at all. To her, this man was simply the odd Englishman standing next to his well-dressed wife. "Have you seen Tosca before?" Heinrich asked with that academic politeness. Ozzy shrugged. "No, first time." Heinrich nodded, having received the answer he expected. "Understanding Puccini takes years," he said, turning to Margaret with a smile. "Perhaps dozens of listens, hearing each layer separately, noticing the subtleties of the orchestration." The sentence was delivered politely, but the subtext was clear. You wouldn't understand. Sharon's eyes flashed dangerously, but Ozzy spoke before she could. In Scarpia's second aria, when the orchestra drops down and only the cello and double bass are left, there's something there, something dark. It's as if the music is whispering something to you, but you can't quite make out what it's saying. 3 seconds of silence. Heinrich's glass froze in midair on its way to his lips. Margaret raised her eyebrows. This was not the kind of observation you'd expect even from a first-year doctoral student in musicology. There were no technical terms, but the musical intuition was sharp, almost savage in its accuracy. Heinrich composed himself. "An interesting observation," he said, the contempt in his tone somewhat diminished this time. "Puccini's orchestration is indeed layered, but to truly understand it, you need a musical background. You're involved in music, are you?" A faint smile formed on Ozzy's lips. "A bit," he said. But at that very moment, a man entered through the grand doors of the Gustav Mahler Hall. Tall, around 50, grey hair combed back. He was the most striking figure in the room in his black tailcoat and white bow tie. Maestro Carl Friedrich Lehmann, the conductor of that evening's Tosca, visiting boxes during intermissions, having brief conversations with important guests. It was part of a century-old tradition at the Vienna Opera. When Lehmann entered the hall, he first headed toward the diplomats, shook a few hands, received a few compliments. Then he slowly made his way toward the buffet. And at that very moment, he saw Ozzy Osbourne. He stopped. The glass in his hand swayed slightly. The expression on his face shifted from professional courtesy to the shock of recognition. Then he walked with quick steps, leaving the diplomats behind, toward the small group in front of the buffet. Heinrich assumed the conductor was coming towards them. After all, he was Professor Weber, Vienna's musicology authority, a name conductors knew. But Lehmann walked right past Heinrich. Didn't stop. His eyes were on Ozzy. "This can't be," Lehmann said, switching from German to English, his voice hushed but trembling with excitement. "Ozzy Osbourne, in my opera, in my Tosca." He reached out, clasped Ozzy's hand with both of his and squeezed. There was a childlike brightness in his eyes, his professional composure completely dissolved. Sharon smiled. She'd seen this before. Heinrich's face froze. Margaretta's hand, mid-adjustment of her pearl necklace, hung suspended in the air. Professor Weber had heard the surname, but hadn't made the connection. Now, watching one of Vienna's most respected conductors behave like a fan in front of this elderly Englishman, his mind was racing. "Maestro Lehmann," Ozzy said, gently shaking the conductor's hand. "You're doing a good job tonight. Those low strings on Scarpia's entrance hit me right in the gut." Lehmann laughed. A real laugh, the kind that echoed through the Gustav Mahler Hall. 13 years, Lehmann said, still not letting go of Ozzy's hand. 13 years. You wouldn't remember me, but I haven't forgotten that night for a single day. Sharon stepped in. What happened 13 years ago? Lehmann turned to Sharon and began to tell the story. In 2005, he'd been a young conductor of 37, living not in Vienna but in Los Angeles. He'd finished his master's in music at UCLA, was conducting small chamber orchestras, but no major ensemble took him seriously. Broke, hopeless, a man who believed his career was about to end. That summer, a friend had taken him to Ozzfest. Lehmann had never been to a metal concert in his life. The ticket was free, the weather was hot, and he had nothing better to do. Listening to the first bands on stage, I felt like I was in a completely foreign world, Lehmann said, his eyes gazing into the distance. Noise, chaos, uncontrollable energy. The exact opposite of everything I'd learned at the conservatory. But then Black Sabbath took the stage. Lehmann paused, took a sip of champagne. Heinrich and Margarete were hanging on the conductor's every word. Other guests passing through the hall had slowed down too, a small circle of listeners forming. The opening of War Pigs, Lehmann said quietly. That siren sound, then the heavy riff that follows, and then the vocals coming in. As someone with a classical music education, standing there listening, I noticed something. There was a structure to this music. It looked chaotic, but underneath there was an architecture. Like the leitmotif system in a Wagner opera, recurring themes, counter-melodies, tension and resolution. It was just being spoken in a different language, with different instruments. Ozzy was listening. Silently, arms folded across his chest, head tilted slightly to one side. Sharon was watching her husband's face. There was something in Ozzy's eyes she rarely saw. It wasn't quite pride. It was more like the quiet relief of realizing that someone truly understood you. Lehmann continued. When I got home that night, I downloaded Black Sabbath's first 6 albums. For a week, I didn't listen to anything else. And then something happened. My own music changed. The way I conducted an orchestra changed. I started carrying that weight, that dark tone, into classical music. When I was conducting Mahler's Second Symphony, during the funeral march in the first movement, I thought about that somber march in Sabbath's Iron Man riff. And that night, the orchestra produced the sound I wanted for the first time. Lehmann turned to Ozzy. Everything changed after that concert. Within a year, I received my first offer from a major orchestra. From Berlin. 3 years later, I was in Vienna. Now I'm here, conducting Tosca. And all of it started on a 40-degree afternoon, in a dusty amphitheater, the moment I heard your voice. The silence in the hall created a void that was palpable even within the hum of the intermission. Heinrich Weber had drawn thick lines between high art and popular culture, had defended those lines in his books, his lectures, his conferences. Now, one of Vienna's most respected conductors was describing how a heavy metal festival had transformed him, and this was demolishing every one of Heinrich's categories. Ozzy took his hand out of his pocket and placed it on Lehmann's shoulder. His hand was trembling, but the touch was warm. "Mate," he said, in that familiar Birmingham accent, choosing his words slowly. "We wrote those songs in Birmingham, in a damp basement, with a rubbish amplifier. Tony's fingertips were cut off. Bill the drummer could barely stand up. Geezer and I had no idea what we were doing. When we were making that music, Wagner was the last thing on my mind. We just had this anger inside us, and we needed to get it out." He paused, smiled. "But if that noise is what brought you here, to conducting Tosca, then maybe music really is just one thing. We're just entering through different doors." That sentence hung in the Gustav Mahler Hall. A few listeners applauded. Lehmann wiped his eyes, trying to regain his professional composure. "The second act is about to begin," he said, glancing at his watch. "But Mr. Osbourne, if you'll allow me, I'd like to invite you backstage after the final curtain." Ozzy looked at Sharon. Sharon nodded. "All right," Ozzy said, "but not without Sharon. I get lost when that woman leaves my side." On the way back to the box, Heinrich gathered his courage and walked up to Ozzy. "Mr. Osbourne," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. "What I said earlier, my comment about needing a musical background, I apologize. I overstepped." Ozzy stopped, looked at Heinrich. "Mate, if you only knew what I've been through in 69 years. A bloke once threw a bat at my face. Next to that, your comment's practically Mozart." Heinrich didn't know what to say for a moment, then laughed. A real laugh. Margaret was hearing that laugh from her husband for the first time, too. Throughout the second and third acts, the atmosphere in the box had completely changed. During that heartbreaking moment when Tosca sings her Visi d'arte aria, Heinrich glanced at Ozzy from the corner of his eye, and what he saw shook him. Ozzy's eyes had filled with tears. The aging rock star was wiping his eyes with the sleeve of his tuxedo, quietly, hoping no one would notice. But Sharon had noticed. She reached for her husband's hand and squeezed it. In the dark box, two old hands held each other, with the weight and the lightness of 40 years. When the opera ended, the hall rose to its feet. Ozzy rose too, and he clapped. When they went backstage, Lehmann was there to greet them. Some of the orchestra members were still around, packing up their instruments. When Lehmann introduced Ozzy to the orchestra members, an elderly cellist stood up. "I know you," the woman said, her eyes bright. "Because of my son. He's a metalhead. He's got your poster on his wall. I've been looking at that poster every day for 20 years. Ozzy laughed. "Tell your son to change the poster. I'm too old now. I don't look scary anymore, just funny." 6 months later, Heinrich Weber added a new section to the musicology curriculum at the University of Vienna. Heavy metal and classical music, shared roots, different branches. In the course's opening bibliography, Black Sabbath's Paranoid sat alongside Puccini's Tosca. A year later, Lehmann organized a special concert with the Berlin Philharmonic. The program, selections from Wagner's Götterdämmerung and orchestral arrangements of Black Sabbath's Iron Man and War Pigs. The concert sold out in 2 hours, and Ozzy never forgot that night. Years later, after he'd announced his Parkinson's diagnosis to the public, a reporter in an interview asked him, "Has your relationship with music changed?" Ozzy was quiet for a brief moment. Then he smiled. "I watched an opera in Vienna once," he said. "Tosca. And that night I realized that music is a single river. We all step into the water from different places, but the river is the same river.